Thank you, Brian. And Brian mentioned good morning to everyone joining us on the West Coast. I will say good afternoon to everyone joining from the East Coast and Central time zones. Thank you again for joining us on our presentation today on reaching plan giving prospects missed by prospect research. I'll start with a quick overview that the next half hour is intentionally data rich. We wanted to shorten the webinar to a half hour rather than an hour to respect everyone's busy time. But we encourage you to enjoy the next 30 minutes, remembering that a recording of the entire presentation will be provided. So with that, we'll jump in, and I will mention that Brian, who gave the great introduction just a minute ago, is going to help us stay on track. He will also be fielding questions, so he mentioned the question box. We encourage everyone to ask questions as we go through the presentation. Brian will field those questions. We'll be happy to answer those towards the end. And Brian will also be in charge of ensuring that everyone receives today's recording. So you will certainly hear from Brian again, both today and after today's webinar. I'll mention quickly again, my name is Kevin Bauman. I am the Director of Philanthropic Initiatives here at Capture, where I have spent the last 15 years working with institutions across the country, integrating both their annual giving, major gift, and planned giving campaigns. So without further ado, let's jump into today's presentation. So know that the goal of today's presentation is not to chastise prospect research. When you registered for today's webinar, you probably noticed the stat that 80% of visitors to the plan giving site are not assigned and have never been assigned. And our goal today is not to say that that's in error. Our goal is to say that there are new resources available for prospect research to better identify interest in plan giving. Because historically, we've had the challenge of predicting plan giving interest, trying to predict who is interested in a plan gift, what that interest may be, when they're actually interested in a plan gift, and where that individual is located. And if we had all four of those pieces of the puzzle, we had a decent shot at predicting plan gift, but oftentimes missing any one of those would present a major challenge for predicting plan giving interest. What we're going to cover today is the difference between predicting and identifying plan giving interest. And identifying plan giving interest starts with marketing automation. And so I'm not going to turn this into a Capture commercial, but it is beneficial for everyone to understand how this data is collected. Marketing automation is basically a small snippet of code that goes in all outbound e-communications. When the e-newsletter goes out, maybe it's plan giving communications, maybe it's the year-end solicitation. Anytime an individual interacts with those e-communications and they land back on the institution site, marketing automation identifies that individual because there's also a small snippet of code that lives on an institution's website. And when the code on the institution site talks to the code in the email, we're able to identify visitors to the individual site. And so with that background, just know that marketing automation is identifying visitors not only to the plan giving site. Marketing automation is identifying visitors to the athletic site. It's identifying visitors to academic site. It's identifying visitors to the different centers and programs that we all have across the institution's entire website. Today, our focus is going to be on plan giving. Now, you may be familiar with marketing automation from some of your commercial browsing. If you own a Netflix account and you receive a recommendation to watch a movie based on any previous movies you've watched, that is marketing automation at its finest. Delivering relevant content based on individual behaviors online. If you have purchased a airline ticket in the recent past, know that the matrix pricing that you see when you go on to buy an airline ticket includes marketing automation because they are tracking the number of times you go on and look at an individual airline ticket. And so part of their pricing algorithm is based on, have you looked at this ticket before? Have you looked at this ticket 2 and 3 times? And the more you look at that ticket before you purchase it, the more the airline knows that you're interested in the individual ticket. And lo and behold, your price becomes more expensive than the person sitting next to you. So if you take one thing away from today's webinar, know that clearing the cookies when you go to purchase an airline ticket can reduce the cost of the price of your airline ticket. Now, we went over 4 variables in the beginning. Who's interested in the plan gift, what their interest is, when are they having the plan giving conversation, and where can we reach the alumni? So that's where we're going to really focus our time today. And so let's get started with who is visiting the plan giving page. So based on the alumni that Capture Higher Ed is tracking to plan giving sites across the country, we know that 1% of all alumni visit the institution's plan giving page annually. We know that over 85% of those visitors do not have a plan gift documented, and that might go in line with the 80% of visitors that are not currently assigned to a gift officer and have never been assigned. We also know that almost half of those visitors would not qualify for a major gift officer outreach. Now, if we talk about this data scaling and we say 1% of all alumni visit annually, know that that data is enough information to fill a plan giving officer's portfolio for an entire year. So the visitors to your website, to your plan giving website, provide enough leads for your plan giving officer to suffice them throughout the entirety of the fiscal year. So let's talk about the challenge historically, because historically we've been focused on predicting information and predicting plan giving interest. And the challenge with giving history, which is oftentimes used in predicting interest in a plan gift, is that over half of alumni to the plan giving page did not give last year. Moreover, almost a quarter have not given in the last decade or more. The most common gift is only $100, and the most common capacity rating is between $100 and $250. So that's the difference between identifying individual interest in plan gifts and predicting interest in a plan gift. And since we know that a plan gift is likely the largest gift that an individual will make, we know that capacity ratings are a great place to start, but it's certainly not representative of the plan gift that will come in. We're really working to identify the plan giving interest. So now that we know who visits the plan giving site, let's meet an actual visitor to an institution's plan giving site. So let's meet Amy. And let's ask ourselves, would Amy be on our radar? So Amy graduated in 1990. She has not given in over 5 years. Her lifetime giving is less than $2,500. And so I'll pause for a minute to let you consider those factors and saying, would our predictions indicate that Amy is a strong plan giving prospect? Now, the reality is for the institution that Amy graduated from, they did not identify Amy as a strong plan giving prospect, and arguably rightfully so and understandably. Now, would it surprise you to know that Amy recently visited the plan giving site? I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of reading. I understand that we generally don't put this much information on a slide, but I'm going to ask everyone to do just a little bit of reading today. And this is actually Amy's visit history to her alma mater's website, starting with her visits to the plan giving page. Now, on July 10th, Amy went to the plan giving website. She subsequently went to the alumni page to research scholarships 3 different times over the next 3 weeks. And each one of those visits, she spent 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and just a couple of minutes on that third visit researching a scholarship. She then went back on August 6th and downloaded multiple resources about leaving the institution in her estate plan. Now, I think we can all look at Amy's behavior and say, Amy is somebody that we should be talking to. We can't assure you that Amy is going to leave the institution in her estate plans, but we can say that Amy is an individual that we should be talking to and offering ourselves as a resource as she's going through this planning decision in her own mind. It's beneficial to note, as you see at the bottom of the slide there, many visitors bounce between the athletics page, multiple academic pages, and then back to the plan giving site. So the data that Capture has indicates that 95% of all activity from visitors to the plan giving page is actually elsewhere on the institution site. So it may be that just like Amy, her first visit was to the plan giving site. Well, 95% of her activity is actually going to be with her individual area of affinity. And so maybe for Amy, that's a scholarship, but for another alum, that's going to be the athletic site, or maybe that's the entrepreneurship center. And that's the value of tracking alumni activity across the institution's entire domain. So we now know who's visiting. We now know what they're interested in. Then there's the critical importance of when the plan giving conversation is happening. So when we look at visitors to the plan giving site, it may surprise you to know that over 25% of visitors to the plan giving site graduated after 1990. So historically, if we were using grad year as an indicator of age, and we were drawing a line at the grad year of 1985, we would miss a full 25% of those alumni that are interested in a planned gift. Moreover, almost 20% of visitors to the planned giving page did not graduate from the institution itself. So this is going to vary from institution to institution, depending upon how much community engagement an individual institution has. But if we focus solely on graduates before 1985, we would miss a full 25% of alumni and 20% of community engagement that we would overlook simply by using predictive analytics alone. So some of the challenges in using giving history and using predictive analytics is that there's actually the largest generational transfer of wealth is occurring right now. And so we know that younger alumni are coming into wealth in unprecedented and unpredictable ways. We also know that non-graduates are coming into wealth in unprecedented and unpredicted ways. And so the challenge of a plan giving officer is to find the Goldilocks moment, knowing that wealth is being distributed in unpredictable ways. And so that's the value of marketing automation, is being able to identify the individual moment when those conversations are happening within a household. So we now know who's visiting. We now know what they're looking at. We also know when this conversation is happening. Let's talk about the fourth critical variable. Let's talk about where this alum lives. So because marketing automation connects with the institution's CRM, as soon as they are identified on the institution's planned giving site, we immediately know where they live, we immediately know their contact information, and we can begin the cultivation process. Now, maybe fortunately or unfortunately, the data is pointing to more than half of alumni visiting the planned giving page live out of state. And so if we were using historical prediction analysis that relied on attendance at events or attendance at a football game or interacting with the College of Business dean at a local event, over half of the visitors to the planned giving site would not have the same opportunities that a predictive analytics software would be looking for. But now, by identifying individual visitors from across the country, we can identify the 2 alumni that are in Phoenix, Arizona, that are researching a planned gift today. And so no longer do we need to rely on prediction, nor do we need to send the planned giving officer to an area where maybe there are wealthy alumni or maybe there are high concentrations of alumni, because as it turns out, we have not seen data to support that simple concentrations of alumni nor wealth are direct indicators of a planned gift interest. But what we do know is that researching a planned gift is a direct indicator. And so as you try and decide where the planned giving officer should travel to, understand that it may not simply be locations with more alumni. It may not simply be locations with wealthy alumni. We should be traveling to locations where individual alumni are actually researching a planned gift today. Now, we mentioned the value of tracking alumni activity across an institution's entire web domain. So what you see in front of you is some data that Capture has from analyzing visitors across the entire web domain for partners. And you'll notice that at the very bottom of this analysis, you'll see that activity on the planned giving site represents 0.5% of all alumni activity. Now, I hope this doesn't dissuade anyone. As you remember from earlier, we know that even visitors to the planned giving site, we know that 95% of their activity is actually elsewhere on the site. And so there's a lot of value in better understanding the entire picture of an individual alum's affinity by tracking their activity across the entire page. So again, we don't have to try and predict or we don't have to try and guess at what their actual point of affinity is. We can simply identify that point of affinity and use that for meaningful outreach when we begin our outreach. The other value of tracking alumni across the institution's entire web domain is that we can identify high affinity alumni that are older graduates that may be having the planned giving conversation in a more traditional manner. Now, we talked about the 25% of alumni who graduated after 1985 that were having the planned giving conversation, but that also leaves 75% of alumni that graduated before 1985 that are having the planned giving conversation. And so we can take that analysis and we can monitor alumni activity across the institution's entire website and we can identify the older alumni that are highly active on the institution site, directly relate that to a affinity metric, and then begin prioritizing our outreach to high affinity alumni who are having that plan giving conversation more readily in their household. And what you see in front of you on this graph is an actual representation of one of our partners' graduate distribution. And you can see that the older alumni with higher visits, in the light green circles, those are actual individual alumni. So you can think of each one of those individual bubbles as having a name, as having an email address, as having a street address, and the ability to reach out to each one of these alumni as they begin to float to the top of this chart, and we prioritize our outreach based on the number of visits and their grad year. And fortunately, as we track the number of visits, we're able to assign an affinity index. And the Capture Affinity Index is directly related to the average lifetime giving. And so what we know is that the frequency of online visits directly correlates to the average total lifetime giving. So if my affinity metric is on the low end, so maybe it's 1 to 50, you can see that my average lifetime giving is just a little bit north of $10,000. Whereas if we get up into the 75 or more rating, you can see that the affinity metric goes all the way up to nearly $50,000. So it's important to know that, yes, identifying plan giving interest on the plan giving page is the leading indicator of identifying plan giving interest for an institution. But by tracking individuals across the institution's entire web domain, we're able to identify older alumni who have increased affinity, knowing that that increased affinity directly correlates to increased lifetime giving, and then prioritize those relationships for the plan giving officer as well. So short of saying that marketing automation will cure all of your woes and we can simply track all of the alumni visiting your plan giving page to fill your plan giving officer's portfolio, there are some takeaways that I think are important for an institution to be able to implement today. The first is making sure that plan giving messaging is reaching younger alumni. Now, it may not be that our graduates of the last decade or our recent graduates are included in this population, but we certainly want to start expanding the plan giving messaging to alumni who maybe graduated in the 90s or even in the 2000s. Again, knowing that because of the generational transfer of wealth that's occurring, that alumni are coming into wealth in unanticipated and unprecedented ways. Another takeaway would be to travel. Remember that over half of visitors to the plan giving site do not live within the same state. And so it's important to make sure that we get on a plane, but it's also important to remember that simple concentrations of alumni and simple capacity does not directly indicate that an individual is having the plan giving conversation. So be willing to travel, but be very strategic with your travel. It's important that we leverage the entire website. Know that alumni are coming to your plan giving page, but then they are going to other areas of the institution site to better identify the actual point of affinity that they have and use that information when they're making their estate planning decisions. And then the fourth takeaway would be to please look beyond gift officer portfolios. You may remember that a little more than half of visitors would not qualify for major gift outreach. And if we're using our gift officers as the first line of offense to identify plan giving leads and qualify those, then we would be missing almost half of visitors that are interested in the planned gift. So please, please, please start looking beyond gift officer portfolios, especially as it pertains to plan giving messaging. So one last takeaway from today is the scarcity of insight or inaccessibility of insight. I will tell you that Dr. Tom Golden is here at Capture, and I took this from him because I think it very clearly identifies the difference between prediction analytics and identifying visitors to the website. So what you're going to see is an orange tree, and this is the parable is told through an orange tree. And we all know that low-hanging fruit is the easiest fruit for us to get. So as an individual, if we're looking for something to eat, we're going to come along and we're just going to start eating those oranges. And as I eat one orange, there's still an orange left. And as I eat a second orange, there's no oranges left on the bottom. And we start to look at the orange tree from the ground up and say there's a scarcity of oranges. much like in plan giving, as plan giving officers and major gift officers come to us saying, there's a scarcity of leads, we need more leads. Well, based on the tools that we've had previously, we perceived that there was a scarcity of plan giving leads. But then a tool like a ladder comes along, and there's no longer a scarcity of the oranges, because I now have the ability to climb up the ladder and get oranges at every level of the tree. What we hope you take away from today is that there is not a scarcity of plan giving leads. There was just not the right tool to identify those plan giving leads efficiently. So we hope that you consider marketing automation as the ladder in this parable to help identify additional plan giving leads for your team, and know that there is not a scarcity of plan giving leads at your institution site. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian, who has been collecting questions, and we'll start answering questions with the remaining 7 minutes that we have.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. I want to thank everybody for submitting some questions throughout the webinar. The question box is still open, so if you have any more questions as we go through the questions that have already been asked, please keep posting them. We'll get to as many as we can with the time that we have left. First question I have is referring back to Amy. Did Amy go to the website organically, or did she get there via some link that the institution sent out to her?
Wow, that's a great question. So Amy's initial visit was via a e-communication that was sent out from the institution. And so it was actually a plan giving message, and the link to that message directed Amy directly to the plan giving site. And so one of the integral parts of marketing automation is integrating with outbound e-communications. I will mention that if you're concerned about it, I can speak specifically about capture behavioral engagement. Capture behavioral engagement is designed to integrate with your existing outbound e-communications. And so you would not need to change your e-communications provider or have Capture send those out for you. It integrates directly with existing e-communications already scheduled in your solicitation calendar. So yes, thank you for that question, but Amy was directed to the site by an email.
Fantastic. Another question we got is, do high capacity alumni visit online?
So that's another great question. I think we talked about that capacity metrics for the plan giving page, that the most common capacity metric is between $100 and $250. Now, if we looked across the institution's entire site, we could tell you that a little more than half of all major gift qualified prospects have been identified for our partners within the first year. So as you think of the total number of prospects that you have qualified at $25,000 and above, because that's where we're drawing the line for major gift capacity, the metric that we're able to provide with Capture Behavioral Engagement is tracking over 50% of all high capacity alumni or major gift qualified alumni, tracking those alumni, reporting on those alumni in real time, and delivering that information to the appropriate gift officer every morning.
Another question we got just came in right now is, how many times do communications related to go out to higher education institutions on an annual basis? This is about plan giving.
Sure. You know, I think that's going to be unique to the individual institution. And so based on your solicitation calendar, if you have a specific communications flow for your plan giving team, you know, I would encourage you to reevaluate that to better understand, would it be helpful to add an additional communications flow or additional piece of communication to increase your identification rates. Should you choose marketing automation, the more communication and more meaningful communication that you send to alumni to get them to click through and engage with that content, the more you're going to be able to identify these visitors, and the more success you're going to have in identifying rather than predicting. And so the question about the frequency of plan giving communication, I think, is unique to each individual institution right now. But I would encourage you to consider, if you haven't constructed a specific plan giving communication plan, to certainly be integrating that into a solicitation calendar.
Another great question. How does this work with a microsite?
Great. Okay, so microsite. So for anyone not familiar with a microsite is often provided by a third-party vendor where a third-party vendor tracks activity on a single site. And so let's use a crowdfunding example. So if you're running a crowdfunding campaign and you want to identify all of the visitors to your crowdfunding site, there is the opportunity to use what's known as a microsite. Now, the unfortunate thing about microsites is they can only track on that individual page. And so what we know about microsites is that if we're only tracking on one page, maybe we'll steer it back to the plan giving page. If we're only tracking the plan giving page, you may remember that we would only track 0.5% of all alumni activity. And even more so, if we were only tracking on the plan giving page and we identified visitors on the plan giving page, we would not have the ability to identify their actual area of affinity when they go and they visit the scholarship page or when they go and visit the athletics page, because we're only tracking on a single page. And so even for visitors to that plan giving page, we would miss 95% of all of their activity if we were simply using microsites. So although microsites are a great start, we would encourage you to consider the opportunity cost of tracking just a single page, where full marketing automation would work well in tracking every page that an institution has. So thank you for a great question about microsites. If you're using microsites and you like the results from your microsites, please reach out after this presentation, and we would love to tell you about expanding on those efforts.
Fantastic. We got another great question coming in. Are there any limitations to the types of communications marketing automation codes can be embedded into?
So limitations. So right now where we embed the code is through a mail merge file. And so we would integrate with outbound e-communications. So it's an individual string attached to each alum, so it becomes an individual link. In terms of limitations, could it be placed in an image and that sort of thing? I would have to follow up with our chief technical officer on that. I can tell you that historically, we've had great success in integrating this code in outbound e-communications via the individual links that alumni would click through. And since it lives behind the link, the end user does not see anything different. So the end user is directed directly to, if we use Amy as an example, Amy would click the link, she would be directed to the plan giving site, and her user experience would not be interrupted at all. It would just be the identification process that happens because of CVE code being embedded in the link itself. So I'm sorry if I'm not answering that question. For anybody who's asking that question, please follow up with me directly. I would be happy to connect you to our chief technical officer, and maybe we could get you some of those answers more directly.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. And thanks everyone for joining today. Unfortunately, we're kind of running out of time. I wanted to be able to let you all know that you will be receiving a recording of this webinar, and I will be personally following up with you if you have any additional questions, or we would love to get your thoughts on some of the subject materials that were brought up today. Feel free to reach out to either Kevin or I, which will also be included on that follow-up email, both of our contact information. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd be more than happy to talk about marketing automation and its abilities to identify and communicate with prospects at any time. So once again, we would, on behalf of us here at Capture, and we would like to thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.